So, I am with Nathan Robinson here, impresario of many different persuasions. And we are going to discuss something that has been just maddening to me over the past week. Something that I wish that it was no longer necessary to talk about.
Yeah. You wouldn't have thought it would go on this long, would you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess...
Maybe you would.
I sort of did. It's surprising to me that the tenor of the discussion now is still so frenzied and impassioned, given that we at this point we have some distance from the election. But actually something that I talked about on the TYT show this past week is that, the 2016 election was anomalous in the sense that it really sort of catalyzed a reordering of American politics, more so than most elections have. So it's not surprising to me necessarily that the debate around its causes, or at least the causes of the outcome, would still be so hotly.
Well, there's kind of no way to get out of it, right? I mean, of course, a lot of Democrats have a choice now between whether they look inward or keep just pointing fingers in various directions. And looking inward is going to be hard because it's going to require, I think, a sort of fundamental readjustment of their worldview. And so it's understandable that it would take a while to get from the finger-pointing phase to the, okay, what do we do phase? Because it's actually not easy if you are a certain kind of Democrat, because it requires you to acknowledge a number of things that are very, very difficult to acknowledge.
Yeah, so on the one hand, you have this kind of expansive evaluation that could theoretically be conducted, which is, how did the Democratic Party fall so out of favor among these core constituencies? The upper Midwest has been obviously an object of much discussion. What can we do programmatically that could maybe endear us to those constituencies once more? So that's sort of a far-sighted discussion. But right. Instead, what we're in the midst of now are sort of these granular debates over what specific variable caused Hillary to lose. And, of course, the variables that Democrats have wanted to talk about incessantly are Comey, the Comey letter, and Russia. And now, even Democrats, I think you'll find, are at least rhetorically or superficially willing to engage in this reevaluation process. Like Tom Perez has made gestures toward that. People who are regarded as establishment Democrats, at least on the surface, tend to be willing to say, yes, we need to engage in this reevaluation. But on the other hand, in practical terms, what's mostly discussed is these exogenous factors that supposedly took victory away from Hillary, deprived her of victory. That's what I would say. Hillary didn't
Which
lose.
She deserved, right? There's an implicit premise that she was supposed to be the president, and that Comey took away what she was entitled to.
Right. I like to say that she, rather than Hillary lost, she was deprived of victory.
Right. Which is the way it's thought about, right?
It is. But the thing is, so if the popular conception, at least among Democrats, is not that she lost, but that she was deprived of victory, then that's going to forestall any kind of meaningful reevaluation, notwithstanding the rhetorical overtures they might make toward the necessity of engaging in that reevaluation.
Yeah. Well, because she won the popular vote, but then James Comey took away her rightful entitlement. And so why would you have to do anything different when you don't bear any of the responsibility?
Yeah.
And you wouldn't if you didn't.
No, I mean, if their depiction of the Comey letter is accurate, which I don't think it is, but let's stipulate that it is accurate,
sure,
that he did just maliciously intervene for maybe even the explicit purpose of thwarting Hillary or damaging her, then it's sensible that they might not feel that this wider reevaluation is needed because the strategy that Hillary apparently had embarked upon was destined for success.
Right. And nobody could have predicted this thing. Although even, again, the funny thing is, even conceding that premise, it's still true that by nominating a candidate under FBI investigation, you put your candidate in the hands of a potentially malicious operator, which wasn't a necessary thing to do. So it still is actually sort of your fault because of who you nominated. But
right. That's why I think it's really crucial to get into the weeds of this Comey letter situation, what precipitated it, the investigation which preceded it. I find it very tedious at this point to have to go through these motions, but
it definitely is.
But the popular portrayal of what happened here is just to me just mind-bogglingly wrong. Mm-hmm. And if that's allowed to crystallize into history, then I think future generations, not to sound grandiose about it, but future generations really are going to have a warped perception of what transpired. So you have like the short-term problem of this inhibiting Democrats' ability to faithfully reckon with what occurred, mm-hmm. and then the longer-term possibility that this mythology now, this kind of cynical, opportunistic mythology, is going to cohere into actually prevailing history, which is disruptive in its own right.
So I guess there are two questions. There's first that empirical sort of discussion of whether, in fact, Comey's letter had a serious enough effect to tip the election, and then there's that separate question of whether the letter was justified or malicious. But the answer to that first one, I mean, what's happening, I think, that you see is that people are assuming the maliciousness and then moving very quickly to the empirical question,
right?
Without actually trying to think through that very important question. Because the empirical question doesn't matter if it was justified. Then if it caused the outcome, well, that's fine because it was justified.
Right.
So you can't object to anything if it was justified, but you skip past the question of justification in order to focus on the question of whether it had an effect on the assumption that it was unjustified. So it is, I think, important to go back to that question of what caused the letter, what the letter was about, what the nature of the investigation was, and where things were at that point.
Right. Those aspects of this need to be disentangled, and they ordinarily are not disentangled in the popular discussion of this. Right. So people say that just to rephrase what you just said, people generally believe, and Democrats generally believe, that if the letter did have a determinative impact on the outcome of the election, that alone would make the issuance of the letter unjust.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And we should also say that the reason that we're talking about this right now is because Hillary Clinton gave a widely covered interview this week where she once again kind of like fainted at the notion of taking personal responsibility for the loss.
I know, I love that.
But then immediately pivoted to blaming two exogenous factors for the loss, which is like, doesn't really make sense.
It was, of course I take full responsibility. And also, if it had been, if the election had taken place on October 27th, I would have won it.
Right.
So yeah, there is a kind of desire to simultaneously have and eat cake there.
Right. So let's parse these different framings here. So you and I were just talking a little bit about this prior to getting on Skype, and basically we have to kind of figure out whether the issuance of the letter on October 28th was merited. Also you have to kind of separate that question from whether the email, because Democratic pundits said all along throughout the primary process, right, that the email server investigation was a nothing burger, that it had had no substantive meaning. It was basically just an attempt to malign Hillary. It was something that was trumped up and taken and blown out of proportion, right? That's what I'll call the Matt Iglesias take.
Yeah, and he wrote a long thing that suggested that the 2016 election was decided by something that was nothing.
Right.
That's how history should remember the 2016 election, was someone maliciously taken down by a fake scandal.
Right. So there's this one claim that the email server investigation itself was fake or incredibly disproportionately covered, at least, and then the Comey letter. So you could imagine one believing theoretically that the email investigation server, the email server investigation was based on overblown premises, right? But also that the letter that stemmed from the investigation that was issued on the 28th of October was warranted for whatever procedural reasons were invoked by.
Yeah, well, I mean, Comey says, and it's important to evaluate his justification, he says that the reason he sent the letter to Congress was because he had told Congress the investigation was closed and the investigation was not in fact closed, and that the ethical thing to do, the responsible thing to do at that point, would be to inform Congress that what he had said before no longer remained true. And so you can believe that justification is okay, even if you think that ultimately, and in fact, if you're sort of siding with his own conclusion, because he said there wasn't grounds for a criminal charge in ultimately, so you can believe that, or you can go further and say the entire investigation should never have taken place. But all of that's consistent with either thinking the letter was justified or not justified.
Right, which is to say, let's bracket the question about the substance of the investigation in the first place and consider whether Comey's stated rationale for the issuance of the letter was valid, or whether his justification for it is sound. So, like you mentioned, Comey, when he announced on July 5th of 2016 that the investigation was closed, he The investigation at that point, which had been opened 1 year prior, July 2015, went from active to closed. And then he was brought before Congress on multiple occasions and stated under oath that if there were anything caused the resumption of the investigation, he would notify Congress. So, in other words, he had an affirmative obligation to apprise Congress if there was any change in the status of the investigation. So I think we can pretty much agree that the discovery of evidence that hadn't been previously reviewed, and which the metadata and the metadata of which suggested was pertinent to the investigation, and investigators apparently felt that it was incumbent on them to seek a search warrant to evaluate that newly recovered evidence, that would amount to a change in status of the investigation, right? It would go from inactive to active.
Yeah, and you can suggest that they shouldn't have investigated that, but on the premise that they were going forward with it, they sought a search warrant. It's true that what he had previously said to Congress, that status had changed; it no longer remained true.
Right. So at that point, he had an affirmative obligation to notify Congress. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes. I think if he said he would under oath that he would inform Congress if there was a change in the status of the investigation, then yes, that's absolutely true. And the reason that the part where I think that the part where I personally am critical of James Comey's actions in this case is that he didn't. I mean, now he says that he just sent the letter to. He said, "Well, I mean, he was questioned about, well, why did you comment in a way that made a huge public scandal?" And he says now, "Well, I was just telling the people on the Judiciary Committee. I wasn't. I mean, I was just trying to get it through to them because they were the people I owed an obligation to because of my testimony. I wasn't trying to meddle in anything other than telling those." But I think that is a bit of a distortion of what his stated justifications were at the time, because at the time, in the letter he wrote to the FBI employees explaining the decision, he said it was not just for the purpose of clarifying to Congress, but it would also be, what he said was, quote, misleading to the American people were we not to supplement the record, and that and that he didn't want to be misleading, but that it was important to keep the American people updated and not misled. And the reason that I'm critical of that, because he's used that as one of the justifications for the letter, is that he didn't want to mislead the American people and suggest that the investigation was closed. But I think that he should have known that the kind of letter he sent would create a misleading impression on the American people, because we know for a fact that the American people assume investigation to mean wrongdoing, and that in a world of innocent until proven guilty, investigation shouldn't mean wrongdoing at all. And in fact, the reason I'm critical of him is because of a criticism I have of all investigation and prosecution practices that disclose information that implies guilt and creates a misleading public impression and damages your reputation without you having been convicted of anything in a court or even charged with anything in a court of law. So I'm not, if he really had just justified it by saying, well, I literally am just upholding the oath I made to Congress, I would be more sympathetic than the fact that he said he didn't want to mislead the American people, because I think he did mislead the American people, and that he should have known that that letter would mislead the American people.
My understanding of what he meant by, this, we don't want to create a misimpression for the American people, was that, Congress is the stand-in for the American people, right? I mean, so if he's notifying Congress, he's thereby notifying the American people. Maybe that's just sort of a colloquial way to refer to it. But yeah, I think that's a legitimate qualm.
But he makes clear that it is a justification to have that he also talked about how he believed that it was important to also think about potential consequences close to an election. Now, if he had said, I don't think that should factor in, but he actually has said that he did think that that was something he needed to weigh. And so I do think that there is a sense in which he would have known, as you wrote about this, that it was going to underscore the existing feeling towards the Clintons that Hillary Clinton is involved in corruption and deceit. Now that, I believe, is mostly Hillary Clinton's fault. But if you're worried about it, but if you really do think that the impression that you leave near an election is an important thing and you should strive to create an accurate impression, because investigations don't imply any wrongdoing, I think you have to make a special effort in that case to make it very, very clear that your investigation doesn't imply any wrongdoing, and to make it very, very clear that you don't know whether you have anything at this point, and that you may in fact have nothing. And I don't think he made that sufficiently clear, even though I do think there's a plausible justification for disclosing the existence of the investigation.
So my question would be, did the obligation that he articulated before Congress, meaning he had an affirmative obligation to notify them about any changes in the status of the investigation, would that justification alone override other considerations? I mean, should that be regarded as warranting his issuance of the letter, even if there might have been other factors that he had to weigh, such as the impact politically? I mean,
well, if he had to weigh the impact, if he had to weigh those other factors should not have necessarily caused him to not. I don't think those factors should have caused him to not tell Congress. I don't think anything should have caused him to not tell Congress if he believed that was his obligation. But I think if those factors matter, then you are also under another obligation, which is to take affirmative steps to minimize the misimpression that will inevitably be gotten from raising the specter of criminal wrongdoing about someone, when in an innocent until proven guilty world, they shouldn't have the specter of criminal wrongdoing attaching to an investigation.
So it's not that the creation of that misimpression should compel Comey not to issue the letter.
No.
It's that it creates an additional burden on him to clearly explicate the fact that the resumption of this investigation doesn't necessarily imply criminal wrongdoing.
And I think his letter was very vague. It was a very short letter. It was not clear. He said, there are some additional things that might be pertinent. We don't know anything yet. And I think that the way the letter was handled, when it was handled by, I am totally open. When he said in his testimony, when he said, I was weighing two bad decisions, and one bad decision would have been to conceal the fact that we'd reopened the investigation, and the other bad decision would have been to reveal it and then end up creating a misimpression. I totally sympathize with that. But I think if you realize that you are going to inevitably have a massive ripple effect and you want to minimize that, he should have taken some other steps, even if I accept that his justification for disclosing the investigation.
Okay, so I'm open to that. I'm open to maybe it would have been preferable for him to more clearly outline what was entailed by this announcement. Yeah. But normally when you have people objecting to the letter, they're not objecting just to the wording of the letter. They're objecting to the issuance of the letter in the first place, which doesn't seem to account for the events which precipitated it having to be issued. And that's always my problem.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I don't think you can criticize the letter as if it's prima facie unjustified, because you have to consider the justifications that he offered. And I think the justifications that he offered at least make it so that it's an arguable issue. Now, he was told by senior Justice Department officials not to issue the letter, because the Justice Department said that the practice of the Justice Department was to make no comment on ongoing investigations and that he shouldn't issue the letter. So I don't know, but he says that it's a different circumstance because he's telling Congress about the reopening of an investigation that he said was closed, right? And so I think I think that's complicated, and I don't know what the actual ethical guidelines that, if any, that bind him are.
I don't think any did bind him because it was such a sui generis situation, right? You can't find an example of anything remotely comparable occurring that would be grounds for formulating guidelines on this, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, so the Justice Department said that it was not consistent with the practices of the department, which is to sort of err on the side of not saying anything. And I think there's an investigation now into whether it was in fact appropriate by the Justice Department.
Yeah, there's an Inspector General.
Right. And so so it's possible that it will come out that they say that he shouldn't have done that because the policy should be, if there's any doubt, then you shouldn't make any comment at all. And if that's the policy and he violated the policy, then he violated the policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, but the ultimate point here is that his stated rationale for the issuance of the letter is at least not outrageous.
That's the thing, right? But I think it's such a more close call than a lot of Democrats are suggesting it was.
Right. And the grounds on which Democrats have objected to the issuance of the letter tend to be fallacious. So, for example, they will say, you'll often hear, and I get this almost every day at this point, well, if he said something about the Clinton investigation, then he had an obligation to also say something about the Trump-Russia investigation. Right. And I just sent you a piece that I wrote on this, right? Right. And the idea is that that's actually a literal false equivalence. Right. Mostly when people shriek about false equivalence on the internet, they're trying to counter a claim that didn't actually assert equivalence between two things. But in this case, false equivalence would be apt for that objection because they're asserting an equivalence between the Trump investigation and the Clinton investigation, which doesn't exist. For one thing, Comey hadn't gone before Congress and made any statements under oath about what he would do if there was a change in status of the investigation. The Clinton investigation was closed and then reopened, whereas the Trump investigation was in the early days of being opened. So the chronology was totally different. The scope and nature of the investigation was totally different. So the idea that Comey should have just affirmed this arbitrary standard whereby saying something about the Clinton investigation necessarily obligated him to say something about the Trump investigation, that really would be taking into consideration partisan politics, as if it's within his mandate to ensure parity right?
And to add prejudice, right? Because most common, I think it's fair to criticize investigators for issuing public comments on things that haven't led to criminal charges. But the idea that you should, but because those things are prejudicial, but the idea that you should just add more prejudice to create an equality of prejudice is bizarre. There would be a hypothetical equivalence if what Comey had done was, when he announced that the Trump investigation had brought up nothing, he then didn't make any comments on it, because he was criticized for making unnecessary additional comments of judgment when he announced that they weren't going to refer the charges on the Clinton investigation. And that might be if he'd done that, but because he didn't do the announcement before the election, you can't make the equivalence. There's no equivalent circumstance.
Right. Right. There's no equivalent circumstance, and then yeah, I mean, but so this kind of lazy knee-jerk response that he should have said something about, because he said something about X, he should have said something about Y. To me, just totally ignores crucial distinguishing facts about the two investigations.
You can still criticize him for making comments on X. Right.
Right.
You can still say, I think it was improper for him to announce anything other than the fact that they weren't going to recommend charges be brought.
Right.
You can say that, and that's a debate we can have. And I probably sympathize with that, because I don't believe that the FBI should publicly damage people's reputations when they don't have evidence that they've committed crimes. So I do think it was gratuitous for him to issue comments on Hillary Clinton's judgment, and probably beyond what the scope of his job ought to be. So we could criticize that, but the idea that the Trump investigation has relevance, I think, is completely false.
Right. So just to put it another way, if you believe that there were improprieties associated with investigation X, you can criticize those improprieties without saying that there should have been additional improprieties
Right.
for another investigation, right? That doesn't really make sense. So on July 5th of last year, he gave a statement announcing that the investigation had been closed, at least preliminarily. And in doing that, he basically criticized various practices that Hillary Clinton had employed, said that there was a potential violation of statutes, gave a whole bunch of information about the nature of the investigation that ordinarily would not be disclosed if the judgment was that no charges were warranted.
Right.
Do you think there's any rationale for applying a different standard to a presidential candidate, which might justify the disclosure of this additional information?
I actually think it goes the opposite way, right? I think that the problem with that was that in that instance, he was thinking, he was making a sort of political calculation of I have to be fair, right? It was almost well, I'm not bringing the charges, but I do need to point out the criticisms because this is a presidential candidate and I don't want to be seen as, right? I want to be seen as even-handed. But I think if your job is essentially you're the police, you should treat all people equally, and that the police should recommend that there's sufficient evidence to charge someone or not, and that should be, and if there is, that should happen in a court of law. But the police's job is not to go out and cast judgment upon things that you've done. And just issue statements of that. And I don't think that changes if you're a presidential candidate, because I think everyone should be treated equally. And the demand, but of course, the Democratic demand is also that Hillary Clinton shouldn't have been treated equally by the FBI investigation, because she shouldn't have been subjected to the kind of arbitrariness that affects all other prosecutions and investigations. Right, she alone should be exempt because she's entitled to the presidency, and I think that's false. I think political considerations should be very, very minimal, and that to the extent that Comey made them in adding that commentary, I think that was understandable but wrong.
Right. I guess, the FBI director has a role that maybe goes beyond what you would attribute to just an ordinary, to like a local police department, right? Yeah. Since he has to answer to he's a political appointee, right? For one thing. He's ultimately answerable to the attorney general, who goes through a political process to be appointed. Given, this is what has been reported and what he has said, given, that Loretta Lynch met with Bill Clinton on this tarmac, and perhaps tainted at least the public perception of how this case was being handled, there were additional layers of obligation that were placed on Comey to address doubt about the veracity of the investigation. I mean, do you think that shouldn't be considered at all?
It's plausible. That is an understandable defense that he would make. Ultimately, but this is just a matter of my personal set of values and my beliefs as to what the role of investigators ought to be, because in a healthy society where I'm skeptical of having too much power be vested in the hands of agencies like the FBI.
Right.
So if people were critical of him for that reason, because they didn't believe that it was the role of a principled reason, rather than just because it hurt Hillary Clinton, I think you can make a principled criticism that says that this shouldn't be the role of the FBI. But if there aren't actual guidelines, if nobody's laid this down, this isn't a law, then it does come down to his judgment, and his judgment could be, well, I need to balance out the appearance of impropriety with the Loretta Lynch thing by explaining what we found, and transparency is important when it's in an election. Totally understandable.
I don't think anybody really argues that he violated a law in making a July 5th statement. I mean, the point of having an FBI director is that you vest in him discretion to handle sensitive topics. Right. So if you have a principled objection to the FBI director having those powers in the first place, fine. But if you think he just didn't equally distribute his opprobrium among the two candidates, you're not making a principled objection. You're just Right. You're just annoyed that that exertion of his power ended up damaging your favorite candidate.
Yeah. I think he acted within the bounds of what is reasonably his discretion in the way our system is set up. I just also think that the way we set up discretion in these matters is actually very, very dangerous, because it invests a lot of power in investigators and prosecutors.
Right. And we should get to this point now, I think. The reason why James Comey was in a position where he was vested with such huge power is because Hillary Clinton chose to seek the Democratic nomination, notwithstanding a felony criminal investigation targeting explicitly her conduct and the conduct of her closest aides and surrogates, right?
Yeah, this is the thing that really gets me angry, because I will just boast that I wrote this article in March called "Nominating a Candidate Under Active Investigation by the FBI is an Incredibly Risky Gamble." The thesis of which was, if you choose someone who's under investigation, you're taking a massive risk, because, as with all prosecutions, even if you believe the charges are baseless, in the United States criminal justice system, baseless charges get brought all the time. Yeah. People get convicted on unreasonable grounds constantly. So it's a massively risky gamble, because the U.S. justice system is often arbitrary, and you're placing your fate in the hands of that justice system and relying on it to work well. Unless, the only way it's not a risky gamble is if you expect that justice system to work differently for Hillary Clinton, because she is a publicly prominent person who shouldn't be subject to and won't be subject to the same injustices that everyone else is subject to. So you either concede that Hillary Clinton has her own justice system, and you're confident that in her personal justice system she'll be fine, or you're taking a massive, massive risk and rolling the dice.
Right. So the idea was that Hillary should be afforded special treatment or basically the people who were arguing that this was a nothing burger and that nobody should be concerned about the potential political ramifications of nominating a candidate under federal criminal investigation, embedded in that argument was this idea that Hillary would be, given treatment that maybe wouldn't be afforded to your average citizen. So, they were actually making a pretty compelling critique of the two-tier justice system and saying that Hillary, needs to get, shouldn't be subjected to its depredations in the way that, ordinary citizens would be.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone else, I mean, I'm a criminal attorney, and for anyone else, the fact that there's the evidence that the charges are baseless doesn't lead to the conclusion that therefore I will be fine, because the question is what's actually going to happen in this process. And in fact, in the process of people being prosecuted, even if they're confident that there isn't evidence to support a criminal charge, that process can ruin people's lives and careers. So you should be frightened unless you think that, Hillary will be fine because the two-tier justice system will help her out.
Right. And so this is why when people focus on the Comey letter, right, rather than the calculation on the part of Hillary that running, notwithstanding this liability, was wise. It just makes me so. I find it maddening because I mean you can debate the machinations that underlie Comey's decision and the specific protocols that maybe were relevant in the issuance of the letter, but the point is none of this ever would have came about but for the decision to wage a campaign when these factors were at play. Yeah,
the question is, why are you running someone who's under criminal investigation?
Yeah.
Well, why are you doing that? I mean,
is there no one else available?
you're placing you're depending on the James Comey. His judgment. You're placing your fate in his hands. And you can complain afterwards, he was really unfair to me. But it didn't have to come down to James Comey if you'd nominated someone who wasn't under investigation, right? I mean, it shouldn't have been up to him. There shouldn't have been such a high percentage of risk built into the candidate's chances. And so that's what really irritates me is that even conceding all of the things about how it was completely unjust, you got to ask how we got here in the first place. And of course, the way that they dealt with this at the time in March, when I was writing and suggesting this is a serious thing that could have serious effects, the way they dealt with that was not to prove that it wouldn't have serious effects, but to actually lie and say that this was a security review and not a criminal investigation.
Yeah. So I went back and checked, and I shared that March piece at the time because I found it just bewildering that the risk posed by an ongoing federal criminal investigation wasn't being adequately weighed by Democratic voters. And the reason that wasn't being adequately weighed was that there was this truly relentless propaganda campaign waged by Clinton's sympathetic media types, Clinton's campaign itself, etc., to deny that there was an investigation going on in the first place.
Yeah.
Even though the New York Times in July of 2015, so at the very beginning of the primary season, had reported that a criminal investigation was underway. And of course, Media Matters and Mother Jones and all these other venues which were sympathetic to Hillary, they launched into a furious frenzy denouncing the New York Times and saying that this was another example of Hillary being subjected to unduly harsh media treatment. But it turns out that the New York Times was 100% correct.
Yeah.
In that.
They did succeed in pressuring the New York Times to retract or downplay one of their descriptions of how serious the investigation was. And it turns out it was actually Eric Wemple of the Washington Post has an analysis of this, or just last week, where he was pointing out that actually it was more serious than even the New York Times' original reporting. But the Clinton campaign was relentless in pressuring the Times to not imply that the investigation was as serious as it actually was.
Right. So, and people, and I just need to keep emphasizing this point, because if the actual facts of the investigation were made known to Democratic voters, then the outcome could have been much different. And the reason why the picture of what was going on was so distorted was not just because of some organic process, it was because of an active campaign of deceit. And you can find evidence for that because WikiLeaks, when it released John Podesta's emails, one of those emails was authored by David Kendall, who was a longtime family lawyer for the Clintons. And he was basically giving talking points to Clinton surrogates in August of 2015 on how to portray the investigation not as a criminal investigation, which it was, but as a security review or some other euphemism that would make people not think that there was some kind of criminal liability here. And the fact that so many media figures latched onto that, and the fact that even Bernie Sanders couldn't bring himself to just speak honestly about what was going on here. Not that he had to be some kind of trailblazer or demagogue the issue, right? But just speak honestly about the political liabilities that this would entail, to me was just a huge collective failure and was suggestive of certain pathologies in the Democratic Party that still haven't really been reckoned with.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. They were desperate to suggest that there was nothing going on, but didn't realize that if there is actually something going on, you shouldn't pretend there isn't, because that's going to come out and it's going to hurt you. But you're sitting on a time bomb here, because if you're lying, what if people find out about like all the lies? Right? You're taking a massive risk through lying to people. And the Clinton campaign consistently lied to people about it. And the lies actually really hurt. So, I mean, the factcheck.org and the New York Times have both run things that have concluded, not in sort of in no uncertain terms, they've suggested that they've said plainly the Clinton campaign lied multiple times. Hillary Clinton herself lied when she said she'd never received classified information, and then she distorted what she'd actually received, and then she said it wasn't marked classified, and then it turns out it was. And then at every stage of the investigation, they also lied about what it was. And you should call a lie a lie. They were lying about, they knew that it was more serious than it actually was. And they don't consider the possibility that maybe even separate, maybe you could have convinced the American people that there was nothing to the investigation. But what they chose to do was try and mislead people about it on the assumption that people wouldn't find out that they'd misled people about it. And if you mislead people, then the cover-up is worse than the crime, right? And then it's hard for people to believe that there isn't actually something there because you have actually misled them about the nature of the investigation. And,
right.
and you're in a position of going, no, I'm not lying about this, I was lying about that.
And by misleading people about the nature of the investigation, you're feeding into this pre-existing belief that the Clintons are constantly marred by at least appearance of corruptive practices, right? So that predated the email investigation, but because of the way that the email investigation was handled, it amplified that feeling. And so,
because they were being dishonest. So if you want to create the impression that Hillary Clinton isn't being dishonest, then you shouldn't be dishonest.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so it's funny because, when I think back to when I was going around, just the day after the Comey letter was issued, I went around and was reporting in different swing states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, and I would bring this up with people just to see how they were interpreting the news. And almost without exception, people could not explain what exactly the Comey letter was or what was meant by it or what process it initiated. All it did was just reinforce their long-standing view that there was something shady about what the Clintons were up to.
Yeah.
So
Now, I think that is an indictment of both Hillary Clinton and James Comey. The fact that the letter the contents weren't very clear to people, I think that suggests that maybe Comey had didn't exercise his responsibility in trying to make it clear what he was actually saying.
Yeah.
But
when people talk about the Comey letter, they're always doling out blame solely to Comey. Right? And to me, that just misses why this had the impact that it did.
Yeah, which is that, maybe if you hadn't been lying about the investigation before, then people would be more sympathetic to you when you tried to explain away this new development, and they'd be willing to listen to you. But at this point, you've cried wolf too many times. You sabotaged your credibility. And so you have primed people for something like this, to interpret it as being worse than it actually is. I wrote once about the way that Hillary Clinton lies, and there's always we should just concede that Hillary Clinton says a lot of things that aren't true, because she has this pathology of saying things that aren't true. I broke down one of her most famous incidents of saying something that wasn't true, which is the Bosnian sniper fire story, where she said, I landed in Bosnia, we got out of the plane, I had to run because we were under sniper fire. And then video came out showing her walking from the plane. And meeting a little girl on the tarmac and having a sort of ceremony. And then I think the Philadelphia Inquirer asked her and said, well, we've discovered footage of you walking from the plane and meeting a little girl on the tarmac, and there's no sniper fire. And instead of saying, which would have been fine, well, sometimes our minds play tricks on us, and we remember ourselves as being more heroic than we actually were. They talked about snipers, and my mind, I'm sorry. I built it up more than it was actually. Instead of doing that, what she did was she said there was sniper fire, but then I was told that this little girl wanted to meet me. And so I said, forget the sniper fire. I have to meet I'm not going to disappoint this little girl. And then it turned out that story was completely false, because they showed more footage where there was a huge press ceremony on the tarmac. So she just made up a story about how there was still sniper fire, but she ignored it because she just didn't want to disappoint a little girl and crush her heart, right? And so it's this instinct to cover things up that don't actually need covering up, which is exactly what happened with the investigation into the emails. And in fact, I just reviewed this new book, Shattered, about the Clinton campaign.
Uh-huh.
People inside were pressuring her over and over to just apologize for the private email server, and she wouldn't do it. And Barack Obama was furious, and Neera Tanden couldn't understand why she wouldn't apologize over the email server. And they said, just apologize. Just instead of creating this appearance of dishonesty.
Yeah, and I think a reason why the lies surrounding the email investigation ended up being so damaging to her is because she is a lawyer. So the idea, and a lawyer of like some distinction, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that she could have just been totally oblivious about the details of this criminal investigation that were targeting her just defy credulity, right? So here's one of my favorite examples of something which is just so unambiguously a lie, it's almost hard to even believe, right? So in July of 2015, Hillary Clinton did an interview with CNN, and she was asked by Brianna Keilar, the interviewer, about a subpoena that she received from the House Benghazi committee, right?
Right.
Hillary Clinton said, quote, "I've never had a subpoena." Okay? And it later came out that she received a subpoena in March of 2015, just a few months prior. So it's just like there's no way to disentangle, there's no way to justify that. And this is why people, I think, were more moved by her lies than Trump's, because Trump, over the course of just one sentence, could contradict himself like up to 5 times. He was just sort of like a rambling, walking self-contradiction, whereas for Hillary, the lies were calculated and they were demonstrable.
Right. And it's such a stupid lie, right? If you received a subpoena, people are going to find out. Just say it. Just say, yeah, I received a subpoena. there's nothing wrong with receiving a subpoena, and then say tons of people receive subpoenas. You're suggesting that a subpoena proves something, which is just false. So, just tell the truth and deal with the truth. Don't treat people like they're stupid and you can fool them, because it's not going to work. And this is like, I mean, Bill Clinton did the same. I mean, Bill Clinton's the master of this sort of thing, where he tells lies where you go, oh, people are going to, why do you think that's clever? Like, it depends what the meaning of is, and I did not have sex with that. But I mean, you go like, what are you trying to do here? People are going to find out. Just tell the truth, or else it's going to be way, way worse for you. But there is this inability with the Clintons to just be honest and transparent people, even when they haven't done anything wrong.
I know. Yeah, that's why this monomaniacal focus on the Comey letter, as if it just sort of appeared out of the ether and wasn't just another link in a causal chain that went back years. That's why I find it sort of an obfuscation, right? There's Nate Silver, for example, is pushing this theory that the Comey letter probably swung the election. Well, if you say that the Comey letter probably swung the election, why couldn't you also say that the Clintons' pattern of deceit swung the election? Like, why isn't that variable able to be isolated?
Yeah. This gets us to this empirical question of whether it actually changed the outcome. And one of the points that I think is really important here is that proving that it affected the outcome doesn't actually prove that it was the sole cause of the outcome, because the outcome, the cause that you pick as your favorite cause in a close election is totally subjective. Right, so I can single out the Comey letter, and you can single out racism or economic grievances or Hillary Clinton's pattern of deceit, right? And all of us are right, because in a very close election, without any one of those factors, it might have gone the other way. But you are choosing to focus on a particular thing. So people who are choosing. So Nate Silver, I think he successfully proves that in the absence of the Comey letter, she would have won the election. But because you're not considering the other factors that in the absence of which she would have won the election, you're not dealing honestly with the causes of the election. Right.
So that's why the incessant focus on arbitrarily singling out the Comey letter variable seems to me, I don't know, there's a dishonesty there.
And not only that, but even on the Comey letter, Nate Silver is a little bit dishonest, because he doesn't point out that the drop in polls started before 4 days before the Comey letter, and it escalated after the Comey letter, but she started to drop. And also there was at the same time, for the 4 days before the Comey letter, was when people found out that their Obamacare premiums would be going up massively, which I think Chris Cillizza of the Washington Post wrote when that story came out. He said this news would be a disaster for Hillary Clinton if people were paying any attention to it. Well, people do pay attention to their healthcare premiums, and I think it is plausible that had some significant effect, but nobody talks about that. And Nate Silver won't talk about it, and he won't deal with it, because everyone wants to focus on the cause that exonerates the Democrats of responsibility.
Right. And it was also the case that the 2016 election had an unusually high number of people who identified themselves as either undecided or inclined to vote for a third-party candidate. So, Comey letter or no Comey letter, you would have expected some degree of consolidation on both sides around the two major party nominees in the closing days of the race. And that's, I think, partially why you saw the polls narrowing even a few days prior to the Comey letter. So is it possible that the Comey letter sort of accelerated a pre-existing dynamic? Possibly. But it seems to me that the focus on isolating that one variable doesn't really get to or shed light on the other confluence of factors which were causing the race to tighten in the first place.
And not only that, but every time we have one of these discussions, we have to think about the reason why we're having it. And the reason that, and so if you talking incessantly about James Comey is almost totally pointless. If there are other factors that were also but for causes, and that but for those things, the election would have gone the other way, then even if the Comey letter had a massively outsized impact, because it's something you can't affect except by nominating a person who isn't under investigation, you should still focus on the things you can change. Because those are the things that are worth talking about and that aren't pointless, right? So you should focus on the things Hillary Clinton did wrong, even if you think that the Comey letter was incredibly important, because Democrats have to figure out how to run better campaigns regardless of what the FBI does.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I agree with that. And I had another thought there that I now lost, so I'm trying to come up with it. What was I going to say? I don't know. The peril of live recording.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh God, what was it? Let's do a dramatic pause.
Causes, multiple causes. Nice, Comey, Clinton, FBI.
Yeah. I don't know.
But wait, let me just go back to that. So, have you read this Shadow book?
Oh, okay. Here's what I want to say. Okay, so this is just an aside, right? But Nate Silver, who I know has been the object of scorn from you, and actually in the issue of Current Affairs that I contributed to, he was kind of pilloried, much to my delight.
It was fun.
The thing is, I actually have a certain amount of. I find Nate Silver sort of endearing in a way, notwithstanding his sort of annoying prominence. And Hillary Clinton actually cited him directly in the interview that she gave this past week to Christine Amanpour. So he's like a very powerful person at this point, needs to be treated as such. But one sort of minor detail in that piece that he ran this week, basically just kind of rehashing all the Comey letter stuff for the millionth time, is in the sort of like preface to the crux of the piece, he continues to assert, Nate Silver, that the investigation wasn't actually reopened on October 28th of last year. And this is sort of a semantic debate that I had at the time and have continually had, because there's this denialism on the part of people who want to blame Comey and who want to basically exculpate Hillary about whether just the basic fact as to whether the letter caused the investigation to reopen. To be reopened. And you have the New York Times in its big account of the Comey letter a few weeks ago. They confirmed that it was reopened on October 28th. Dianne Feinstein, in this Senate hearing that just went on with Comey testifying this past week, also affirmed that it was reopened.
Yeah.
The term reopened is not really contested at this point, but you had Nate Silver just kind of, in a blasé way, deny that it was reopened. So that, to me, raises the question, how can we entrust Nate Silver with the analytical? How can we trust that Nate Silver has the analytical capacity to accurately explain what happened if he can't even accept this one basic detail?
Well, yeah, and also it's how could you even argue that it wasn't reopened? Because they were looking at the emails, they were investigating the emails. That's an investigation. Right? It's
yes.
And one of the things is they don't distinguish between like security review and criminal investigation. If they're looking into something, they're investigating it. That's what an investigation is, right? And so because they were looking through computers on this to do with this case, looking through emails, that means by definition the thing was reopened. So it's not like a container that you open. It's just like the act of investigating is reopening the investigation.
Yeah. The resumption of investigative activity necessarily means that the investigation is reopened. So if you're looking at emails to determine whether they are pertinent to an investigation, in order to do that assessment, you have to investigate, which means that the investigation was reopened. It's just another maddening aspect of all this that I was mired in at the time. And even now, this mythology persists, which denies that there was a reopening in the first place. So to me, if you can't accept those basic facts, how can you do an honest evaluation of what the Comey letter represented?
I'm totally open to Nate Silver's conclusion, but the fact that he doesn't that he singles out that particular cause is, I think, irresponsible as an empirical social scientific matter, and so right, and so no matter how well he proves his case, there are certain things that tip you off to where he's not dealing with the thing honestly or thinking about it much.
Right,
but
and
I just
just a quick point on that. Like Nate Silver could easily also write a long data-driven piece entitled. So the title of the piece this week was something like, "Yes, the Comey letter probably swung the election to Trump." Right.
Right.
He could also easily write a letter saying, "Yes, Trump's unique, unorthodox appeal among deindustrialized upper Midwestern whites swung the election to Trump." Right. Or you could say, "Yes, Clinton's relative unpopularity among urban blacks in the Midwest swung the election to Trump."
Right.
So the fact that he's made the subjective determination to focus so incessantly on that one variable.
Yeah.
Gives insight into his judgment, right? And
it's he picks it out because
it's not a holistic vision of what happened.
Well, that's the thing. He picks it out as a unique factor to focus on because there's this plummet in the polls after it happens. Right. But the thing is that if other factors hadn't existed, then the whole line moves up, right? The whole set of polls move up to where that plummeting doesn't actually get you below the threshold, and you have to point that out to people if you're being honest. But then this is I just want to go back. Yeah.
Let's wrap this up. But remember your point here. But I just want to, before I forget, okay?
Yeah.
So another point another crusade that Nate Silver is on is condemning his former employer, the New York Times. And Matt Iglesias has done this as well, others. They'll send around this screenshot of the front page of the New York Times from October 29th,
oh, yeah,
right? So the day after the issuance of the Comey letter, and they'll say, look at how outrageous it is that the New York Times would place above the fold significant coverage of the fact that a felony criminal investigation into a major party candidate has been resumed.
Yeah.
And my question is, I mean, how could you possibly expect them to do anything but
that? Exactly. Blaming the New York Times is absurd, right? You can argue about whether Comey should have done it, but to blame the New York Times for reporting the thing as the kind of big story that it was is obviously totally unfair. But I just
so you can yeah. Go on. Yeah,
I've been wanting to just mention the fact that so I just reviewed the book, the Shattered book about the Clinton campaign, this insider's account where they talked to 100 people who were sort of involved with the campaign. And when you read that, the campaign was a disaster, right? It was characterized by horrendous decision making, massive infighting. It was a strategic disaster. It was they relied on these stupid algorithms. They couldn't even define why she was running, right? There were months and months went by and they kept trying to come up with a public justification for why she was running and what she wanted to do for the country, and they literally couldn't. And so you think, when you read all this, you go, how can you not focus on that? You couldn't. They didn't even have a justification for why she was running for president. Clearly, that's the important thing. So,
right. So why is that never isolated as a variable for Nate Silver to run regressions on? Right.
Yeah. Hillary Clinton couldn't give an answer to the question of what she wanted to do as president. Right. That's nobody could make a single policy.
And here's another amazing fact. And this came out actually in the WikiLeaks emails drawn from Podesta's account. Hillary's top advisor, Cheryl Mills, who was involved in the configuration of this email setup and kind of set the events in motion, which led to everything blowing up in their faces, she had privately warned that it was not wise for Hillary to run in the first place, not because she didn't have an impetus for her candidacy or because they didn't have a message, but because the email situation was such a liability that it was going to be that damaging.
Yeah, exactly.
And my mind is always cast back to what if Democratic primary voters had been privy to this information in 2015 and early 2016? Then they at least they would have had a fuller picture of the choices being before them and might not have taken this incredibly risky gamble that you outlined in that 2000 in that March 2016 piece. I don't think the actual nature of the gamble was made sufficiently apparent to them by the media.
And there is this complaint that some Democrats make that voters sort of knew too much, right? So you've pointed out that when people complain about Russian hacking of the election, they're complaining about the disclosure of things about the internal workings of the campaign that people didn't like and that they objected to, and then soured their judgment, but things that were true. Right, so there's this suggestion. Well, we don't want voters to find out about this because then they might not like us. And you go, yeah, that's how it works. When voters find out the truth and they don't like it, that's that's democracy.
Yeah, and even that sort of is even relevant when it comes to the Comey letter in a way, because they are saying that information ought. I mean, you can make a variety of arguments as to the propriety of the issuance of the Comey letter, but the main argument you'll hear, and it's not even adequately substantiated, is that Comey ought to have concealed that information from the public.
Nobody should have been told this investigation.
The information was warranted.
Yeah.
Or maybe the concealment of the information could have been warranted, but it's just an interesting pattern that more information has to be concealed by the Clintons than revealed, or else people are less likely to view them in a favorable light.
Yeah, we're angry at Comey because he told the public that the investigation was reopened. But you wanted the public to vote without knowing something that was true.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess we're close to exhausting this topic for now. I'm sure it'll explode. I'm sure it'll explode onto the scene again. Maybe we can have this discussion almost verbatim in like 10 years.
It's never going to stop. We're going to be having this discussion forever.
Yeah, I mean, in general. So leaving aside the Comey letter, or at least not specifically pertaining to the Comey letter, do you see the kind of crystallization of the mythology around the 2016 election as kind of intractable at this point? Is the kind of opportunistic way that things have been framed, can it be altered by kind of sober and rational analysis that you and I try to provide, or is it so kind of ingrained at this point that it's a lost cause?
Well, I don't know, but remember that it's only ingrained among a very small segment of people. The sort of people. I mean, it's definitely. I don't think you're going to get that out of the heads of certain Democratic-leaning pundits. But large percentage of the country doesn't have that perception of what the election was about at all, and has
that's true.
And actually believes that I mean, everyone who voted for Trump certainly doesn't believe that it was an illegitimate interference. They believe that Hillary Clinton is corrupt and deceitful. So, I think we should be clear, who writes the history. I think the key is to make sure that neither Donald Trump nor Democratic pundits write the history, but the people who are careful and willing to consider all the causes instead of their favorite cause are the ones who make the record.
Right. Yeah. I think that's right. A lot of people are sort of flustered and exhausted at this point at the fact that we still have to be debating the 2016 election. But I almost find I'm not quite as flustered about it.
No,
I think I think given that it was a watershed event, we should expect that the implications of it wouldn't have been fully sussed out 6 months later. I mean, it's going to be a long-term endeavor.
It's so important because what you figure, the lessons that you take from it are going to determine what you do going forward. So it's not an academic discussion. It has a lot of very serious implications for political strategy. Yeah.
Okay, so what can you just give our wonderful viewers here a quick appraisal as to the what's going on with current affairs?
Oh, what's going on with current affairs? Well, we have been publishing for a year. We just put out our March April magazine, which has gone to subscribers and which people will receive if they subscribe now. And we are working on our May June edition, which is about Silicon Valley, tech, and the future. It's our first themed issue, and I'm very excited for it. And we're also, current affairs is about to open up a small office in New Orleans. We've finally gotten to the point where we can afford office space. So we are ascending to the heights of media dominance, slowly and steadily.
Very, very good. The ascendance is inevitable. No one should bother resisting the ascendance because it is upon us.
Yeah, that's what.
So yeah, I encourage.
We're just going to make sure current affairs
subscribe.
dominates the media, and then everything will be fine.
Yes. So I encourage people to subscribe. I've been a contributor in the past, hopefully sometime in the future as well. And yeah, I mean, one of the upsides of the election, actually sort of Ben Smith has talked about this, and I think he's right. Election cycles seem to coincide with the emergence of new media entities that are perceived as having gone against the grain or have done an unusually good job at analyzing the election. And usually that is applied to larger outfits like, say, BuzzFeed, which emerged as a political whose political reporting came about in 2012, and then Politico in 2008 burst on the scene.
Yeah.
But I think also there are smaller scale instances of that where because of the reordering effect of elections, people seek out new modes of consuming information, and to me, current affairs would be one example of that associated with 2016. Especially
because people were so let down and betrayed by every news source over the course of an entire, as you wrote so eloquently about in our last issue, which was about the worldview of various kinds of pundits.
Yes. And actually,
but who are still churning out prophecies and predictions. Can't stop them.
Yes, still. I mean, and who have not really modified their behavior despite my desperate pleas.
It's like the financial crisis, right? Where everyone who gets it, who causes it, and it bears the most responsibility, actually makes out really well and keeps their job and they're fine.
No, I mean, I've actually drawn that parallel. It's like,
have you?
It was the financial crisis or the Iraq War for the media class, right?
Yeah.
Everybody associated with pushing the Iraq War has been rewarded rather than penalized, at least in the media ecosystem. Like Jeffrey Goldberg is now running The Atlantic. He chose David Frum to be his top editor. And there are so many other examples of similar things happening.
You have to spend one day doing a sort of mea culpa, right? Which is what some of them did the day after they went, oh, maybe I should have, and then they just get back to what they were doing before.
Yeah. It's like, no, if you have to make a mea culpa about something of such utterly profound significance, then your mea culpa should really consist of, I am humbly withdrawing from the public's realm at this point. But no, they just continue to be provisioned with huge career opportunities.
I'm going to go read some books and learn some things and talk to some people before I open my mouth again.
Yeah. But the 2016 election was, it was the Iraq or financial crisis for the media class. And what characterized the aftermath of those two crises was that nobody really paid any kind of reputational price for being consistently and flagrantly wrong. Oh. And we're still in positions of power even after their culpability in the crisis was revealed. So if that's the situation we're dealing with, we have to be constantly on guard about people who should have paid a price but did not, still being in positions where they can be dictating to us.
Has anyone ever lost status? I mean, I don't know the New York Times has ever... I mean, they got rid of Bill Kristol for making factual errors, but I don't know if they've ever fired a columnist for being bad or wrong, really. I mean, Todd Friedman's still there. Paul Krugman's gone off the rails, but he's still fully employed. It's astonishing.
I don't think... aside from like the most egregious misconduct of like plagiarism or just fabricating facts, I can't think of an example of somebody who was just analytically wrong
It's
over
better
an
than
extended
tenure.
period of time actually incur. Yeah, they do have tenure. And,
But it's even better than
the New York Times columnist, the New York Times, with respect to the New York Times columnists, it's kind of most glaring. But I think this sort of even applies to people in like lesser media. I mean, there's the incentive structure, and I talked about this in my piece for Current Affairs. The incentive structure is just totally perverted within these media spaces, such that there's no risk of incurring penalty for being consistently wrong, as long as you could just keep doing it and garnering clicks and views.
If the clicks are coming in, why should anyone get rid of you? I mean, the whole thing is about page views. I mean, the one thing I'm proud of with Current Affairs is we don't keep track of page views. I don't have a way of even checking. Yeah, because it creates bad incentives.
Yeah, no, that's true. So you've never looked.
Never looked. I don't know how many people read our magazine. I mean, I know when people tell us that they've seen our thing being posted a lot, and I can get a rough kind of feel for it. But no, because the moment you start tracking these things, it sort of burrows into you, and you can't help but be affected by it. You start doing the things that get you more pages.
I think that's wise on your part. I actually sort of, now that I'm doing videos on a regular basis for TYT, part of that what entails is constantly seeing view counts and like number of likes and stuff on videos, and I'm a little fearful that even just subconsciously that is going to have some kind of corrosive effect on my cognition.
Yeah.
But there's no. I don't know what the workaround would be.
You can't help but feel good when a lot of people read and like your things, and you can't help but feel kind of disappointed when nobody reads or watches a thing. And so then you kind of want to do things that people will read and people will watch. But at the same time, that is just doing the things that are popular rather than things that you think ought to be done. I mean, at a certain point, you've got to do things that you think people are actually going to read. But but page counts.
But you can't be bound by these metrics, right? I mean, you can't let them dictate to you what you ought to do. But at the same time, because they're constantly in your face, and because it's such instant gratification if you receive a X number of likes or views, that's got to have a subconscious effect. Mm-hmm. Notwithstanding whatever mental guards you try to erect to prevent any kind
I've never worked at a real publication, but I am told on reliable knowledge that at many places they keep track of these things in real time, the page counts, and you get told, your piece. Well, I did get told by the Washington Post once that one of my pieces was doing very well this hour, right? Where they said, the 11 a.m. crowd, like they really liked it, and they were following the exact trajectory, and whether it made the news cycle, and how it plugged in to the existing news cycle, and I've also been told, we really like that idea for a piece, but I think it's 24 hours too late, and you think, my God,
I've gotten that before as well.
I hate.
Gawker and Business Insider, at one point at least, did this thing where they actually used the view count. They publicly placed the number of views on their articles to sort of pressure writers into achieving a certain a certain number per day, and people went crazy. I mean, there were people who I think literally lost their minds because they were subject to that kind of.
Well, I can't remember whether
it wasn't just that they privately were aware of their view count. Is that what they and their readers and anybody on the internet could figure out their view count?
Yeah, I'm told that I read somewhere that I can't remember whether it's Gawker or one of the others that kept a big monitor in the office showing like a ranking of which are most popular articles that we like, and that would update in real time, where the things would crawl up and jump.
I think it's the Washington Post.
Is it the Washington Post? God, that's just such a terrible way. They're supposed to be journalists. You can't do that.
I know. It's really bad.
Because no one's going to read your story about refugee families, and everyone's going to read your story about, whether Trump ate the wrong pizza. And, it's such a terrible idea.
I know. And the thing is with you, I mean, since I'm now working more on YouTube, or I've done stuff on YouTube, like those metrics are just really unavoidable. Yeah. Every video has a view count. This video that we're doing now will have a view count.
I know.
Does that impact my decisions on a day-to-day basis? I'd like to think not. But then again, I can't account for my own subconscious kind of,
Who knows?
Urges, right? Yeah. Okay, well, let's leave it there for now.
I think we've gone on a little...
we went on a tangent, but that's
we'll
okay.
We'll start boring people soon.
Yeah.
If not already.
Okay, I will talk to you later, Nathan.
All right, it was fun, Michael. Always a pleasure.